It's kind of funny to me that a couple of years ago I did a tutorial for Resolve 12.5 that demonstrated a proxy workflow for Multicam. And it seems that with Resolve 14 and now again with Resolve 15, I've had to revise this workflow a little bit because there have been sort of subtle differences in the way Resolve is performed. So I find myself once again amending or providing a new tutorial that sort of looks at those differences very briefly, hopefully. So I have 4 camera angles here that were recorded with an XAVC codec that doesn't play back very cleanly in Resolve, at least not with my relatively low-powered machine. So I needed to transcode these into a proxy format, which actually I happen to use DNxHR LB, so the low bit rate version of DNxHR, which actually does play back quite smoothly. I created those proxies simply by taking my 4 original camera angles, and by the way, these were already synced to just the start point of each of them, so you can play around with sync maps. The point of this tutorial is not to actually show how to sync these, so they will sync just from the endpoints of each of the 4 camera angles. Each one happens to contain the mixed down audio that was done in the studio. So I'm not really looking so much for the workflow for the multicam, but more the proxy aspect of it. So I took these 4 files and just used the file menu under Media Management, and then in the Transcode tab, I selected a destination and then used a QuickTime, set it up for DNxHR as the codec and specifically the low bit rate version, and generated then another set of files that have the MOV extension, and these will play back quite a bit faster, and put those in a separate folder. So we started off with the master. I just created a couple of bins, rather, the source bin and then a bin for the proxies, and I'll show you why I did this in a few minutes. And the other thing I did with both these sets is I used the shot and scene settings and specifically set up the angle for each. So the first camera angle, the second camera angle, third and fourth, and I actually reproduced those same settings for each of these angles. I'm just going to turn off audio scrubbing because it's actually interfering with my ability to hear my own voice. Okay, so the next thing I did would be just to take these and make a multicam clip out of these. And specifically, I'm going to use the sync time in. As I say, these were already synced together with a sync map completely outside of Resolve. And then I'm going to use the metadata for camera angle to actually name these. And I won't bother with moving the clips into the original clips bin at this point. So that's all I have to do. Is the endpoint is the sync, and I want the order of these synchronized to the angle numbers. And this then becomes my multicam angle, and you can multicam clip rather, and you can see angles 1, 2, 3, and 4. And why I actually use the shot and scene angle value to produce that. And I can do the same thing then with the proxy. So I've selected all of them. We had those camera angles already set up, and I'll just generate a multicam clip, again using the endpoints and the camera angle. Okay. So maybe I'll just rename this so that I can remember this. I'm just going to drag them into yet another bin called Multicam Clips. Now I'm going to start off by putting the multicam source into a new timeline. I'm not going to use mark in and out points. And we'll just open up that timeline. Now, in theory, I could lay down a separate audio track here. I won't bother at this point. But one of the first things I have to do before I do anything with this is step into, I'll turn off the linking here. I'm going to step into the video by opening it in timeline. So I've selected the video track and I'm going to open it in timeline. And now we can see inside that we've got our 4 camera angles with their related audio. I'm going to select the camera angles and make sure that I have the conform lock enabled turned off. So you have to do that inside. You step into the multicam clip and turn off conform lock enabled. Now here's the difference. It used to be that if I'm going to step back out again just by double clicking on the name of the sequence. So we're back out. It used to be that I could, in Resolve 14, that I could actually come along to the timeline and use the timelines reconformed from bins. And the idea here would be to tell the timeline, I want you to swap out the source media with the proxy media. And that was interesting. I'd forgotten that you also have to turn off the conform lock on the multicam clip itself. And you can see, by the way, the multicam, before we go any further, you can see that if you switch open. Just going to close the inspector here. See the multicam clip on the source side. And this is our record monitor here. And as I drag through this, you can see that it's, even with the screen recording here, you can see how slow it is to update the 4 camera angles. So, it used to be that I could actually take the timeline and use the timeline feature to reconform from bins. And this would allow me to reconform to the proxy. So I'm pointing to the bin that has my proxy files, and then I could use timecode and then a loose file name match because they have the same file name, but their extension differs by the MOV versus the MXF in the original source. And I'd be able to do this, click OK, and well, it would have worked in 14. It appears that in 15, I need to open these up so that my timeline's actually opened up to expose the individual multicam clips. And then, with these selected, I should then be able to go in and reconform from bins. So it's a subtle change. There's my proxy. And what I found, this is very weird, I have a question in for Blackmagic Design on this, because I found that quite often this won't work initially, and I actually have to play around with whether or not it's source or record timecode. So I may click here and it may actually fail again. It didn't. Okay, and this time it worked. So we went from the MXF, we now see that the extension has switched over to move, the MOV file. And before I go any further with this, let's swap it back again to watch it go back in the opposite direction. So once I've done any editing in the multicam, I can switch back and use my original source media to get the best quality when I finally do a render of the timeline. So again, I can reconform from bins, select the source bin, it remembers these settings from before, and click OK, and now it's back to MXF. All right. Back to the proxies, and I'm going to step back out, and you can see now, you should be able to see that these are far more fluid as I scrub through the timeline. In fact, I'll just Shift Z. You can see scrubbing through the full 4 minutes or 3 minutes and 40 seconds worth, pretty much. It's very, very fluid now with those proxies, which would allow me to start playing. And in this case, I'd only want to cut on the video. So by default, it's set up to cut both audio and video, but I wouldn't do that. I'd switch over to just cutting on the video. And then you can start playing here. If you're listening to the music, you can then figure out what you have to do as far as switching. And you can simply click on the different angles, or there's keyboard shortcuts, and you just move over and you can see that it's actually adding edits here. Again, the purpose of this tutorial isn't to go over multicam editing so much, just the proxy aspect of it. Now, you'll notice if we step back in, let's open up in timeline. In here, we're not seeing any cuts. That's the whole point, is we're seeing the contents of the multicam clip itself. And what's very, very cool about this is that from within this perspective, you can actually switch over to the color page and do your preliminary grading across your multiple camera angles. And this will get buried inside the multicam clip. And then you can come out and do your multicam edits with 4 camera angles that are color balanced with respect to each other. And in fact, even in this mode, as I've shown in a previous tutorial, you could just give you an example here. This particular camera angle actually has a couple of dead pixels, and I used dead pixel fixer within this opened timeline to actually apply an effect right at this level, which then meant that every instance in the multicam edit where I actually saw this particular camera angle, it would already be fixed with basically an OFX plugin effect buried deep inside the multicam. And as I say, you can also switch over to the color page, and by default you won't actually see the multiple clips even though you're moving along. You can see that there's actually stacked, basically V1 through V4 are stacked on top of each other. And so even though I'm clicking on these different clips, or you can click here, you'll see that you're not seeing any changes here. That's what this little guy is for. So you can unmix these, and that lets you then see each of these different camera angles, and actually at this point you could also grade. And so you can actually take an angle like this and say that you want to maybe pull some green out of the gamma, and just to balance it a little bit better. That's a bit too red, and so on and so forth. You can take this. You can open up your scopes there, and it's clear that the black level is quite a bit high. So you can actually drop your lift here to bring the blacks. Crush the blacks a little bit, or at least bring them down. And similarly, the gain is blown out. This is some GoPro footage on this camera, as if there was any doubt. And anyway, you can play around with each of these. So now each of these, if you switch back over to the edit page, each of these then actually has a grade on it, and that grade is maintained when we step back out. I'll just double click on the word timeline 1 here. We're stepping back out again. So that grade is actually maintained at this level. So every time you're actually cutting on the multicam clip, you're getting the grades and any OFX plugins that you may have had. But when I initially started working with this technique, the reason I was doing it was because on my slow machine I couldn't actually get Resolve to play smoothly the 4 camera angles so that I could actually clip to the timing of the music, or cut rather to the timing of the music. It was most infuriating. So when you're at this point, let's say I'd gone through the whole piece and I was happy with the timing, I can always switch back, use the timeline reconform from bins, and then at this point I'll just switch back to source. Let's try that again. Remembering to step in first. So let's step into the open in timeline. And then Good thing I have this tutorial recorded. I can always remind myself. It's getting late in the day for me. So we're going to switch back to source. And there we are with the MXF. And then I'll step back out again. So at this point, then we're working with, albeit sluggish, we're now working with the highest quality that we have from our original source files. And if you copy, I would recommend copying it, but you could make a copy of the timeline, duplicate the timeline, and then with the duplicate, let's just double click so that we're going in, see copy of timeline. Switch your timelines here if you want. So we'll work with the copy. At this point, I might actually take this entire sequence and I may actually flatten it. So flattening it basically takes us completely out of the realm of multicam. As basically, I would say, yes, I've locked down the multicam at this point, and then we can flatten the timeline with the flatten multi-clip option, right? And so now we're no longer dealing with a multicam clip. We actually have the individual clips. And if you use this to find out, you can actually find in Media Pool, you'll find that it actually locates the source clip. Now it's funny because even though I created the multicam source and the multicam proxy, I'm not 100% sure that that was required for this workflow. I always do this as a matter of course, and it seemed to be required in earlier versions. I'm not, as I say, 100% sure of that. So I may play with this workflow a little bit more, but hopefully that brief update, actually it turns out it wasn't so brief, I'll hopefully be able to edit this down a bit, but that brief update shows you the changes that are required for 15.1. And again, if I just double click on timeline 1, the most notable change is that whenever you want to use the reconform from bins, you should first step into by right clicking on the open in timeline there. So you put it into this view, and then you can successfully reconform from bins. I'm doing it one more time just for good measure. So I can switch back over to the proxy as such. There we go. Step back out. Switch to multicam view. There we are, nice and fluid. Okay, so thanks for watching. For those who had the patience to get through all of this, appreciate it. I'll see you next time.
Keep on doing what you do.